But what I realized from a personal perspective, I was always very ambitious, focused on the future. But now, since a few years, I'm not anymore. I still have things that I want to do. So I'm now writing my second book, for example, and I'm very inspired by writing that. But I don't have this idea that I have to end up somewhere in the future,
This audio recording is an extension of the community explorations at inlightconnect.com, where we explore self-inquiry, meditation, and conscious observation as a way of connecting with more love, compassion, and freedom. Welcome to the Inlight Connect Community Explorations podcast. This is Heijer. I'll be your host as we journey through this profound and insightful investigation into effortless meaning, purpose, and self-realization. My guest today is Alexander. I'm going to wait for him to pronounce his last Dutch name.
Den Heijer.
Say it again.
Den Heijer.
Den Heijer.
Yes.
Okay.
Heijer.
That wasn't so tough.
Exactly.
But I came across Alexander on Clubhouse and then found myself on his Instagram, and I fell in love with all his insightful little memes and sharings, and also to learn more about his work, which does corporate training, public speaking, and he's also an author of a collection of beautiful short writings that really point you home to the present moment. So, Alexander, welcome, and thanks for coming on to the podcast. How you doing, man?
Thank you, Tiger. I'm really looking forward to this one. We met on Clubhouse before, and what you said there, I think we met in a room where with Jason Silva, I remember correctly, and you said something that resonated so much with me, even though I completely forgot what it was. But I just knew, like, wow, this resonates. I need to talk to this guy. So I'm really happy to talk to you today about, some deep spiritual insights.
I remember that. Jason Silva was talking about the captivation with beauty and art and why it was so important. And I kind of added on to it in the way of, well, it pulls us into presence. It pulls us into seeing what's actually real and what's actually true. And in that, we kind of return to this childlike nature, which is something we're always trying to get back to. And this is something that I see a lot of your writing point to, is just a reminder to come back to the presence. And so I would love to kind of explore your journey a little bit. What is it that brought you to a realization that everything that I want is actually here right now?
Yeah, that's a great thing to dive into. Well, it's quite a story. I don't know exactly where to start, but I think I grew up like everyone else, like most people, have a fairly okay childhood with some ups and downs. I've had some depressions when I was younger, a bit nihilistic. And but I always had this sense that something is a bit off in our society, out of sync, maybe that's a better word. But I didn't know what it was. But then I think the first glimpse I got was when I was about 25, I think, or earlier. But I read the book by Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. And that was something that was like a beginning for me, because that resonated so much. And before that, I was very interested in personal development. Like many people, I started on my personal development journey reading books from like people like Tony Robbins, but that didn't really got me to what I was seeking, right? And when I read Eckhart Tolle, I was like, wow, this is something profound. The lightness of being in the present moment, was so beautiful to me. And then I think things started having a more rapid shift when I started doing Vipassana meditation. Every year I go to a 10-day silent retreat. I practice about 1 to 2 hours a day. And also when I met my teacher in 2016, and that really started that was a bigger shift. And so we can talk about some of the things from there, maybe. Depends what kind of way you want to go.
Well, yeah. And I love what you said about the doorway kind of through a personal development, which was kind of like the initial seeking, and then to stumble upon a pointer toward the present moment. I resonate with that so much because when I was 21, I found myself devouring all sorts of personal development and self-help material. And it kind of just led to another disaster. It's like I shifted the seeking rather than trying to be accepted, like by my parents or by the world, I then developed a strategy to become rich, which was an absolute failure, thinking that that would somehow, solve the dilemma. And the disaster of it kind of brought me back to the present moment to investigate what's more sincere. It's like, okay, there's a seeking here, but what is it really about? And that's what kind of pulled me into the present moment. But I love Tolle's work, and I've read that book as well. And I constantly run into people who have read that book, and it made a profound impact on them. But in your current life and what you're doing, you say that you meditate a couple hours a day.
Yes.
How is that going? And I'm asking as somebody who has no consistent traditional meditation practice.
Well, to be honest, I started with Vipassana in, I think, 2017. I went to my first retreat. And afterwards, I was so enthusiastic that I thought, you know what, I'm going to meditate 2 hours a day, because that's what they recommend to really practice. And I think it took 3 weeks, and then I gave up because it was way too hard to sit 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening. So then I switched back to half an hour in the morning, half an hour in the evening. And I think that lasted another 6 weeks. And then I completely stopped. And then I went to the next retreat the year after, because I go every year. But after every time I go, I'm like, now I'm going to hold on to it. And somehow after the fourth time, there was in the summer of 2020, last summer in June, somehow it clicked. And I was able to sit for 2 hours a day for about, I think, 4 or 5 months. And then I slowly switched it back sometimes. So now it's mostly 30 minutes or 1 hour in the morning, and then 30 minutes or 1 hour in the evening, pretty consistently. That doesn't mean I never skip it. Sometimes I have a dinner with friends that lasts a bit longer, and I'm really in this moment. So I'm a bit mild to myself. I used to be very strict, but then I didn't continue with it, because then I had this inner dialogue, you should sit and meditate. I know I don't want to. But now somehow, maybe because of the practice, it's almost second nature.
Yeah, it sounds like it's moved from this sense of seriousness into it's a playful opportunity to
Absolutely.
Connect with what I actually want. And I think that this is important to recognize, especially about any spiritual practice, is that this isn't a requirement. This is an opportunity.
Absolutely.
When you see the genuine value in just being still, it's almost like you recognize, oh, this is for me. This is a gift that I give to myself. It's not something that I do and then in 10 years I'll become enlightened. It's a present moment gift that I allow myself to fall into, and it's not required. And so if I don't do it, there's no punishment other than my own imagined self-judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And now you also do public speaking and corporate training. Are you focused on teaching meditation, or is there something else going on there?
No, I'm not focusing on that. So I started my career about 13 years ago as a sales trainer, actually, in retail. And then I developed, because I always wanted to train people. And that was really in the field also of personal development. Then I turned to leadership and topics such as purpose and meaning. So I did a lot of talks around that. And then in January 2020, last year, I decided to go back into the corporate world. I was out of the corporate world for about 5 years. I worked for myself. But I wanted to go back into the corporate world to have a solid structure. But also, I have this hate-love relationship with the corporate world. And I went out of it like 5 years ago. I was really like, I want to go out of there. I want to work for myself. But there's also something to learn there. And so I went back. So what I do now is I work with a company that's like the Dutch market leader in employee listening. So we're really in the field of, let's say, cultural change. So enabling organizations to listen to their employees. And what I do is I work as a team coach. So whenever there are teams that want to work with their results, with their feedback, I facilitate those sessions. And I also do a lot of trainings around enabling other people to facilitate dialogues within their team. So I'm really focused on organizational dialogue. But besides that, I'm still writing a lot. I'm also doing some online lectures now with my customers that I had from my own business. And that's more focused on purpose, a bit spirituality. But because I work a lot in the corporate world, I'm very interested in talking about spirituality, but often also from a bit of a scientific perspective, because that's how I find that I can speak the language of the corporate world, so to speak.
That's interesting. I like that. I find that as well, that the scientific lens kind of creates a safe container for some to look in this direction. It's like, oh, there's science. Okay, well, let's talk about it. And as far as I'm concerned, whether it's spiritual or science, it all eventually is going to point towards the truth of life. And so if we look at it from a space of openness and non-dogmatic way, then we're going to discover something profound. But let's dive in to the topic of our show today, effortless meaning, purpose, and self-realization. And as I look at your Instagram and I see these little short quotes, it appears obvious to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things that you're inviting people to see is that there's a noise going on in the mind that thinks purpose is somewhere other than the present moment. And
Absolutely.
we're chasing it and trying to reach it. And what you're inviting one to recognize is a stillness, to almost see that purpose is already done. And if you see that it's already done, then you can finally enjoy yourself. And it's interesting too, because as human beings, we say, well, I can't enjoy myself until I know what my purpose is. And then we project it as an image that says, well, if I look like this or I look like that, then I'll have it and then I can enjoy. But that's, naturally the hamster wheel. And so in your personal experience, tell me about the recognition of purpose already being done.
Well, when I started talking about purpose, I was a bit like that. I thought, if I find this great, grandiose purpose, then I'm there. It's just if this, then that kind of thinking. But I realized that I was also searching it in some kind of form. And I realized one day I was asking myself the question, like, what is it that I'm actually trying to find when I talk about a purpose? What will that be? What will that look like? And I couldn't answer that question. And I remember another time that was had quite a profound impact on me. I was in a meditation retreat, I think in day 7 or 8, and I had this constant inner dialogue, this kind of battle. This almost like the playful child versus the strict parent. Sit down and meditate. No, I don't want to meditate. Sit down and meditate. And then there was all of a sudden this third voice, very calmly, that said, "Stop beating yourself up, kid." And from that moment on, there was a stillness. There was no dialogue anymore going on. And there was sometimes just a little bit of how do you say that? It's almost like a more silent voice, if that makes sense. And I realized something very interesting. And that was something like, if I can't find it right here, right now, I can't find it anywhere. And I realized, like, wait a minute, it's not something out there. It's something that comes from the inside out. And I also think that one of the things, the problem with purpose today is, and I've even heard someone say that there's something exists that's that's called like purpose anxiety. It's the anxiety that comes with, oh, I'm not able to find my purpose. I should find it somewhere. And what helped me is to just be still and be silent, and to it's not that somehow you will find that answer, but it's more that these questions, that anxiety, this voice of anxiety, just slowly disappears. And when it disappears, then there's this stillness, and that also creates some kind of clarity. But what I realized from a personal perspective, I was always very ambitious, focused on the future. But now, since a few years, I'm not anymore. I still have things that I want to do. So I'm now writing my second book, for example, and I'm very inspired by writing that. But I don't have this idea that I have to end up somewhere in the future, It's way more being in the present moment, even though I'm very challenged sometimes in my job, because I have a very demanding, stressful job. So it's very interesting how that works, and how you can quickly sometimes go back into this stress mode, and you're like, you hear the ego talking, and like, there he is again, taking over the show. And it's just, what helps me is to constantly come back, to step out of my own way, and to just reflect, like, what was happening there. And the more I can do that, the more it helps me be more clear, have some clarity.
That's beautiful. And it's similar in my experience. I mean, naturally, with the conditioning was that purpose is fulfilled in the future by becoming. It's like my purpose is to become this or to become that. And I found that it was constantly changing. It's like at one moment I might be inspired to be this or be that, and then the next moment I'm completely not interested. And so I'm like, well, what the hell? I thought I found my purpose. And it was constantly changing and really became ungraspable. And in the failure of that, I started to look at nature, and I recognized that everything in nature, whether it's a flower or a tree or a bumblebee, its purpose is fulfilled in its naturalness. Like just being what it is its purpose. And it doesn't question its value. It's like the flower isn't wondering if its pollen will go to the right places, or if it's enough, or how do I create more. It's like life has said, please just be a flower, and then it's done. And it's interesting because in what I do now with sharing, I recognize that there's just the being of what I am, doing what I do, and there's a joy there. And that joy naturally gets shared, not through a trying and not through a wanting. It's just what happens. It's like when you discover something beautiful, there's a naturalness that wants to share it, not really looking for anything in return.
Yeah, not sell it.
And I think as unique individuals, there's this quality of expression that can only be you. And this quality doesn't really look to compare itself. It just does what it does, and somehow it's enough. And one of the illustrations I use in this, it's like the flower looks at the tree and says, oh my goodness, if only I could be big and tall like the tree. And then the tree looks at the bird and says, oh man, if only I could fly. Then the bird looks at the flower and says, my God, you're beautiful. And each one of these things, they don't see what they are. It's like if we end the comparison and truly look at the miracle of what you already are, it becomes complete. It's only through comparison that we lose the aliveness. We lose the magic. And I noticed that that's what I was doing a lot, was comparing myself to other people and thinking, oh, they have it. I have to become like them. I have to do what they do, rather than seeing that it's not a doing, it's a seeing, which is already done. And then the doing happens automatically, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I really love that you said is that they seem to have it, whatever that having is. And I think what's really key here is that how I often use it, I'm very inspired by the work of Erich Fromm. He was a German-American psychoanalyst, and he wrote a book in the 70s called To Have or To Be. And in that book, he states that there are two modes of being, the being mode and the having mode. And from this having mode, what we want to constantly have more. And when we're in full having mode, so to speak, the ultimate thing we can have is an identity. We want to have a sort of identity that gives us status, and what we do then is that we identify ourselves with what we have. I have this car, I have this relationship, I have this job, I have this status, this identity. But the question Erich Fromm asks in his book, the philosophical question is, if I am what I have and I lose what I have, who then am I? And then you're either like a failed human being, or you wake up and realize that you're like thrown into the being mode of existence, right? Where you just are as you are. And that book really inspired me, because that was kind of the academic version of Eckhart Tolle in some sense. And what I learned from that is that even in the story of the Buddha, when he became enlightened under the Buddha tree, and when he was walking down a path, I think he was at an encounter with a few people, if I remember correctly. And some of them said, are you a god? Because they could definitely see something in him, right? So they asked him, are you a god? He said, no. Are you like a king? No. Are you a man? And he said, no. And they're like, what are you? And he said something like, I am awake. So he wasn't talking about the identity that he has. He was talking about being awake. And I think that's what's really key here is and that's what I learned also from my teacher, because he was an expression of that being mode, so to speak. He didn't even have much and he didn't care about that. But he always talked about inviting yourself to be as you are and allow others to be who they are. Just what you said, the bee can freely be the bee, the flower can freely be the flower, and can you freely be you? That's the question.
Yeah, and I love the exploration into identity. It's one of my favorite things because it's at the root of all the dilemma. It's like my fear of losing who I think I am, as I think who I think I am is really something. But the more I investigate that character, that identity, I see how completely imaginary it is. And in order for it to have any source of survival, I have to keep building on it. I have to keep adding to the story, adding to the identity, which is almost like seeking validation or seeking to be approved of, constantly asking the world, please prove that I exist. Please see me. And that's like an unending quest where there's the illusion of more. It's like to have more only leads to wanting more, which is a belief in the idea of more. And there just isn't anything like that that's real. And it points back to this impossible quest that we find ourselves as human beings of chasing the future. And I see it as chasing some, what I call imagined sense of self-importance, some identity which makes me more than I am right now. And then the more we look at it, we just see that it's impossible. And to really see the impossibility just invites a surrender that says, wow, I don't have to play that game anymore. It's like, I don't have to compare myself. I don't have to want people to like me. I can literally just come back and be what I am. And there's such a magic in that too, because as I come back to the present moment and be what I am and where I am, there's like this sense of wonderment with what's happening. It's like life itself as it is quite magical, which also speaks to the hilarity of thinking that the miracle is coming in the future, which says you clearly don't see the miracle that's happening right now. Because if you really see the miracle that's happening right now, there's nothing that you can imagine in the future that's going to compare to the miracle of life itself. But moving on real quick to meaning, I think this ties in really well to purpose in the way that we're ultimately searching for meaning. And what is it on your journey as you've unfolded into this, I guess, letting go of meaning?
Well, that's an interesting one, because I used to be very inspired by the work of Viktor Frankl, like search for meaning. That there's meaning also even in suffering. And but what I used to search for meaning in the things that I did. I always realized that if I could be a writer, if I could be a public speaker, then I have a meaningful life. And I remember very clearly, like a few years ago, I had a beautiful conversation with my teacher at near the end of his life, because he was suffering from cancer, and he told me something very profound. What he said, and that struck with me. He said, when he got cancer, his life lost its meaning in the sense that everything he loved doing, he could no longer do. Cooking, giving classes, spiritual classes and things like that. But then he said, but this realization opened me up to the awareness that life does not need any meaning in order to live itself. And I never really understood that. I was like, what do you mean by that? But when I started meditating, and especially last summer in June, I was in this meditation retreat where at the day 7 or 8, I kind of lost this mental commentary, that's voice that's always speaking, that's labeling everything that you see around. And I was in this, I would almost call it like a state of no mind, as some people call it. And I realized in that sense that just what you said before, that life in itself is meaningful because it's filled with wonder right in front of your eyes, but it's really hard to see that. And that brings me back to something I will also want to discuss in this talk, if it's possible, because I've been very interested in how this also works in the brain and then left and right hemisphere differences and things like that, because I've been quite into that recently. And what you just said before, what I think is interesting is that life is filled with wonder or even meaning or almost magic, a magical sense of aliveness, but it's really hard if you're stuck in this ego mode, so to speak, to really become aware of that. So I'm also wondering, how did you get into that, or was it like a sudden realization, or was it gradually you became more aware of that?
I think it's both, and something that, happens on a daily basis, where you see beyond the ego and you say, oh shit, that's not real. And then it's an invitation back to the magic that's happening. And it's like my discovery of meaning. You spoke a little bit about the depression and the kind of nihilistic feeling. And I kind of went through that as well. But what I noticed is in my seeing that there was no meaning, I was experiencing my meaning about no meaning. And the meaning that I was creating was shitty. It wasn't that there was no meaning that was shitty. It's how I was interpreting it, which was my own meaning. And so I wasn't even really dropping into the truth that there was no meaning. I was arguing with it. And the more I see that everything is empty of meaning, in the way that if I look outside and I see the horses or the trees, the only meaning that's there is the meaning that I put there. It's like it's literally blank. And so I'm actually creating the meaning that I'm experiencing. Often we think that the meaning is out there and we become a victim to it. But when I see that I am the meaning creator always and forever, then it transforms meaning into this playful thing. It's not like there's no meaning, so don't have meaning. It's no, there's no meaning, so have fun.
But then, would you say that you are the creator of meaning, or would you say that meaning is like a realization that you wake up to?
Oh, that's interesting. Um for me it's waking up to no meaning, which is waking up out of my dream of meaning, which thinks that there's meaning beyond my own meaning. Right? Cuz that's kind of the illusion. We think that there's something happening, and then you wake up and you go, "Oh shit, I'm just imagining that that's happening. It's not really happening." And so waking up to that, you kind of wake up from this dream of fear. Because again, the fear is the idea that the meaning is out there. But when I see that I'm creating it, there's nothing to fear there because it's just from me. And so the waking up that I constantly see, and you alluded to this, which is it becomes very hard when you're wrapped up in the ego, which is wrapped up in who you think you are. And so this has been the discovery that I, see almost every day, is that whenever there's tension or anxiety or fear, I am lost in a dream of who I think I am. And this is what invites me back to stillness and says, be still and discern the difference between what is real and what you imagine to be real. And it all comes back to who I imagine myself to be. It's like I'm living this character as if it's happening, as if it's real, and I've completely divorced myself from an awareness of what's actually happening. And that becomes super exhausting. So the journey, as it's been pointed to throughout, time and history, is see the truth of what you really are. And that resolves everything. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And what I actually hear you saying, if correct me if I'm wrong, is that you get lost you get kind of lost in the conceptual world, with the thoughts, the ideas, the stories about who I am, and you can't find the sense of meaning right there. To find it, you need to let go of all these concepts and be really in the present moment. And I wouldn't even call it the present moment. I prefer the now. Why? Because a moment is finite. A moment ends, a day ends, a year ends. And when we talk about, often it's referred to as the ever present now, which is the infinity. And if you think about it, people often think that eternity is this everlasting time, but it is ever present now. It's not a duration. It's just being in this now. And when you're fully in the now, you cannot be also thinking. If you remember that sometimes we're in a flow state. The mind is still, you're completely absorbed by what you're doing, and you feel this sense of meaning. And there's no voice in the head because you're just in sync with the environment. And I think that's where you kind of find it, that sense of meaning. But what I find interesting, and I would love to share something about that with you, I made a very interesting discovery quite recently, because I've been very interested in right and left hemisphere differences. And for people who want to have a bit of a scientific understanding of things such as ego death, I would definitely recommend to look at the TED Talk by Jill Bolt called My Stroke of Insight.
I've seen that.
You've seen that one? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So what actually happens, Jill Bolt gets a stroke in her left hemisphere. So her left hemisphere goes offline, so to speak. And all of a sudden she finds herself in this vastness sea of infinite peace and stillness, right? Until her left hemisphere comes back online and says, come on, you got a problem. There's a stroke. You have to do something, right? And then eventually she gets help. But then what she realized is that actually these two hemispheres are actually two different people. And that's very creepy. If you think about this, there are like two people in your head, two different personalities. And for people who are really interested in that, I would recommend the book, The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist, philosopher who spent his entire life almost to understand why we have a divided brain. And he spent 20 years writing this book. The subtitle is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Now, what's so interesting about this is that, and I remember in the beginning you said something about children, to be childlike. And almost every spiritual tradition talks about the fact that the pinnacle of spiritual realization is to become like children, Even Nietzsche also said, to become like a child. And even Jesus said, to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must become like children. Now, what's interesting, children rely heavily on their right hemisphere until the age of 4. Then the left hemisphere takes over. And what it does, it kind of deadens everything it sees into familiarity. So that's why they say in Zen, for example, that when a child sees a bird for the first time, and the mother says, that's a bird, from that moment on, the child never sees a bird again. Why? Because whenever it sees a bird again, it goes, bird, I know it, I get it. So it turns it into a concept, actually. And that's the work of the left hemisphere. Now, what's interesting, the case that Ian McGilchrist makes in his work, he uses the metaphor, which is brilliant, I think. He says the metaphor he uses for his work, the title is The Master and His Emissary. He says that there was this spiritual master that looked over a community. And because the community, he was such a good master, the community was flourishing. And because it grew and grew, he needed some emissaries to do the work, So he appointed some emissaries. And then one of the emissaries, there was the brightest one. He started thinking at a moment, you know what? I'm actually doing all the work. I should be the master. I don't need the master. I am the master. And that's the left hemisphere. Now, what the left hemisphere doesn't know, it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So it's blind in that sense. So it thinks it knows. So it thinks I am the master. But it isn't, because it doesn't know what it doesn't know. And the right hemisphere, so to speak, is this silent witness that oversees everything. Now, what's so interesting, when the left hemisphere, the point that Ian McGilchrist makes in this book is that actually something that Einstein said is the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So the master has been betrayed. What does that mean? It means that the ego has taken over. And the ego thinks it's the master, right? But we all know what happens if we're fully identified with ego, or when we're fully in left hemisphere. We become hubristic. Now, what is hubris? The hubristic person believes that his knowledge is complete, and that's the hubris. But now what's very interesting, children, as I already said, they rely on the right hemisphere until the age of 4, and then the left hemisphere starts taking over. And many people are in this egoic mode for the rest of their lives, not knowing what they don't know. They almost forget everything that makes them human. But even worse, they have forgotten that they have forgotten. So what does it mean to become like children again? It's in a way to let go of to kind of make sure that the right hemisphere is the master again. And it doesn't mean in that sense that you don't have a left hemisphere anymore, but that it doesn't have you anymore. And that's what I think is the paradigm shift that Jill Bolt talks about in her Stroke of Insight, for example. And That's something that has been very, and I'm just diving into this. I've been diving into this for the last few months, so I'm just ranting now. So I think I'm just stop here and say what you think of it or what you hear me say.
I think it's fantastic. And what I hear you describing is also what I interpret as the story of the devil. And to quickly assimilate, it's there's an angel in heaven with all the other angels, and then they're all worshiping God. It's like there's a big party that's worshiping God. And then this particular angel looks around and says, "Hey, wait, this party's not about me. I want to have my own party that's about me." And so he leaves heaven and goes and tries to become God. And in his effort to try to become God, he becomes violent. He's essentially telling people, worship me, and then I'll give you what you want. And it becomes a disaster because, for one, it's impossible. And the devil doesn't see that he's one with God. And it's also, it could be said in this way that the devil is simply the Christ not recognizing himself. That when the human being doesn't recognize what they really are, they become the devil. And the devil is associated with the ego. It's that sense of a separate self that has to struggle to survive. And it essentially wants control so that it can survive its separation. And the only way that it can get control is through some flavor of violence. And naturally, that violence gets expressed in the way of, I'll love you if. It gets expressed in the way of, I want you to be this way and don't be that way. You see, it's this attempt to affect the external so that I can get an internal experience. And that's when we become, unsavory human beings, where we're essentially wanting everyone else to change so that we can finally find ourselves or be at peace. And it never works because it's an inside out process. And so this discovery that you're talking about, I see it as the primary dilemma, which is not recognizing the function of ego, which is a playful sense of separation. It's like, in truth, all is one. There's no separation. Everything is everything else. But in order for there to be this dance in our humanness, there has to be a play of duality. There has to be a play of me and you, of night and day, of up and down, of in and out. There has to be that in order for there to be experience. But the experience exists for play. It's when we take it seriously, we introduce fear. It's almost like if we're playing a game and I start thinking the points are real, then I'm no longer fun to play with because now I'm scared of losing points because I think the points mean something about my separate me. But really, the point of the game is to not get to the future and win. The point is to play. And so it's only my misunderstanding, my own confusion, that makes the whole damn thing difficult. And like we spoke about earlier about, the ego getting in the way, it's just simply that. It's taking the character seriously, thinking it's real, not realizing that it's only imagined. Beautiful.
It's beautiful, man. I totally relate to it. And I don't know who said it, but someone once said, was it Nietzsche? I don't remember. Like, the problems arise because humans take seriously what the gods only made for fun.
It was Alan Watts, but he might have been
Watts?
Yeah, he might have been quoting somebody else.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, that's beautiful. And also what you say about the devil, it relates a lot to the kind of the hubris of the left hemisphere when it's lost connection to the right hemisphere, so to speak. And you see that in split brain patients. But what I also find very interesting is that when you talk about play, I remember in a lot of my talks, I always talked about purpose in a leadership sense, running an organization and talking about purpose. I always used the example of finite and infinite games. Are you familiar with that?
Maybe, but keep going.
It's very interesting for people who are, especially in corporate organizations. It really resonates. It's a book that's written by James Cars, I think in 1986, which is called Finite and Infinite Games. And what he says, there are actually two kinds of games that one can play. One is called the finite game, and a finite game has an end goal, and you know that the goal is usually to win. And to make sure you win, you need fixed rules because the rules exist to make sure to know when you've won, when the game is finished. Like a football match or whatever kind of a match. That's a finite game. But you also have infinite games. An infinite game doesn't have an end goal because there's no end. It's infinite. But it does have a purpose. And the purpose of the infinite game is to continue the play, to continue playing. And that's why an infinite game has flexible rules, because the rules only exist to prevent the game from coming to an end. And sometimes in my lectures, people are like, yeah, I've got an example. I've been gardening for the past 40 years and it never finished. You know, like gardening is a great example. The garden doesn't know deadlines and stuff like that. But I find this very profound. You know why? Because when you talk about play and present moment, then I always look at it as infinite play. Because in a finite game, time becomes and duration becomes important because you want to have a fixed outcome. You want to make sure you've won. So you want to kind of control the future, you know, and you want to get rid of surprise. You want to be in control. But when you look at infinite play, there's actually always ever the present moment. And, you know, what are you going to do in the present moment? And then you get into what life actually is. And you get into something that I find interesting is meaning and responsibility. When I live in this infinite play, which has infinite possibilities, I can constantly respond to life by being responsible, by playing with the possibilities that arise right in front of me, right? And then play becomes way more playful, I would even say, rather than serious.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I could see finite games within the infinite game.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, the foundation is an infinite game, and we play or pretend that there's finite games, but they actually serve the infinite game. And so in that, the finite games can be quite playful as well. But, you know, it's interesting because in the finite game, especially in a world of competition, we think that the winning means something. And I'm always fascinated by this. It's like I'm actually watching a documentary series on Netflix about F1 racing. And I don't have any interest or hadn't in F1 racing, but I just enjoy the exploration. But it's fun to see this drive to win from all these different teams. And they're absolutely, you know, kind of stressed out in the process. And then maybe they win, and then there's the celebration, but then they're right back in it, you know, to win the next season. It's like, okay, no more play. Let's get back to work. And then if they become a world champion, it's like it's not enough. It's like we can't lose that now. And this speaks to something profound, is that when you chase something, if you actually appear to get it, you'll then become afraid of losing it. And so you have to keep playing a game that you might not even like playing just so you don't lose what you thought you gained. But when you see that you didn't actually gain anything, it's like the prize was imaginary, then you can set the game down and then go play a different game that might be interesting. But the other third part of the exploration is self-realization. And it seems like we've been talking about this the whole time. And I wanted to hear from your experience, what does it mean? what does it mean in your journey, self-realization?
Well, to me, that's an ongoing process for me because I'm still in the midst of that whole struggle, to be honest. So, and from that struggle, I usually write, you know, I write because I struggle with something and then I got some kind of an insight and I write it down and I share it. But yeah, what does it mean to me? It's just realizing what you are actually, I guess. And yeah, the way we often realize is that by finding out everything we're not, like the neti, what's it called? Like not this, not that.
Yep.
And it got quite of a. It became more interesting to me when I started meditation, actually, because then I started realizing, wow, this is super interesting. And it's like freeing yourself from yourself in some sense. And I like how Ken Wilber framed it. He said there are actually two paths. There's the path of self-actualization, what Maslow coined the term, which is something like growing up. And then you have the self-realization, which is something like waking up. And we both play with both of them, right? But the realization part is to just probably realize what it is that you are. That's how I would probably define it right now. I'm not sure if that's the right definition. I might think about it differently tomorrow if you ask me again.
Well, I think also the self-realization is one of those infinite games where it's not something that has an endpoint. It's actually held within the eternal now, where it's the game of hide and seek. Now I see it, now I don't. That on, off, up, down, in, out play. And so just like realizing yourself, there will be times where you don't realize yourself, and we bounce in between them. And the bouncing in between is the play that allows for discovery. And oftentimes when I did retreats pre-COVID, that's one of the things that I really wanted people to recognize is that, hey, this isn't, we're just going to figure this out and then never forget again. If anything, we're going to embrace the forgetting. We're going to recognize that that's part of it, just like going to sleep at night. The point isn't to be awake 24 hours a day. The point is to allow life to be life. And part of that allowing is to embrace the forgetting and to allow the remembering. Because the real big struggle is the judgment of the forgetting. The idea that it's wrong, or the idea that you shouldn't, or the idea that it's getting in the way of the ultimate realization where you never forget, which isn't going to happen. It's part of the play. And I think you're right on point speaking to seeing what you're not. In fact, in my Facebook page for Tiger Singleton, the banner is just that word, neti neti.
Oh, nice.
And I love it because neti neti, it's a Sanskrit investigation that invites you to be still and watch the mind's attempt to define and to truly see that whatever the mind says, it's not that. And so you watch yourself, observe yourself, other people, and essentially see that the mind can't actually define anything. The mind can give things names and labels, but that's not really what you are. And so as it relates to truly discovering what you are, the invitation is to see that the mind can't see it. And so the practice is to be still and watch or ask the question, what am I? And see that everything the mind presents is not that. And it's this continual release of all of these ideas about yourself to see, wow, I think I'm this, but I'm not really that. It's like, I think I'm a writer, but that's not really true. What is that? Sometimes I write, sometimes I don't. So I'm not that. And it empties ourselves out of these imaginary identities so that we can become more and more present.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It reminds me of a meditation session I had once, and I realized that my mind is like this arm, like this sticky arm with glue on it, that trying to catch every thought and then identify with it, And what I saw happening in my mind was that the glue became less and less, and that the arm became less and less strong, and slowly it could no longer attach to this thought, and then it stopped doing that, and then I get into this stillness, or I called it the sense of not knowing. And that was really beautiful because it was also quite funny. I remember when I went to my last retreat in June, I already had the sense I should stop reading books because I read a lot. I'm very approaching things a lot from the mind, right? And I wanted to stop reading books, and I thought, maybe I should read one more last book. And a book that came to me, I don't even know who sent it to me, was called The Book of Not Knowing by Peter Rawson. I thought it was quite funny because that was exactly what I wanted to learn, to be in the state of not knowing. And that was what happened in this meditation. Afterwards, I realized, and for months, I didn't read anymore because I didn't even want to read, because I realized that reading is just adding content to the mind, and it's nice if I want to learn about history or about some scientific work, that's beautiful, but to use it as self-inquiry, it didn't work anymore because I quickly saw, like, it's just adding content to the mind. But I want to see through that, and point like whatever you think you are, you're not, because it's a thought. And so that's where I am still at the moment.
I think that's great. And I think it's such a profound place of investigation, because when I look at all of my own struggle or tension or fear, it's all based on what I think I know. And the more I investigate it, I realize that I don't really know. And that opens me up to a present moment that's really full of possibility. And
And wonder.
the comedy of it is when I ask myself very sincerely, what do I actually know? It's like, not what do I believe, not what do I think, not what do I want. What do I actually know? I'm in a place where I see I only know I am. That's all. It's
Do
like,
you even
it's,
know that for sure?
well, maybe not in the sentence, but it's the recognition of the awakeness. It's like, that's the only thing that's known. It's the most immediate. And then everything that comes after that is from the mind. And the mind attempts to give labels to something, and we think we know it through our labels, like the bird. But that's not really what it is. And so that creates such a space of openness into the unknown. And for me, it's like, well, that's the truth. It's all unknown. And here I am trying to make it not unknown in the most impossible ways. And I tell myself silly stories of security, which are impossible, rather than just embracing the truth of the unknown, because it will always be unknown.
But that is also what it is to be childlike again, because that realization is, if you look at children play, especially young children, they are not seeking anything. Adults are always seeking, like they're trying to find their way back home, so to speak. But children are just curiously exploring, they're not seeking anything, but they discover all sorts of things because they're just playfully exploring what's out there, and constantly in wonder because they don't know anything, right? So they're constantly wondering, wow, what was that? And what is this? It's such a beautiful, everything is so vivid and alive in the mind of a young child. And that's, I think, what meditation is actually to practicing to become like that child again.
Yeah, it's beautiful, because also in the same sort of pointing, there's the biblical pointing of, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, something like that. And then also it follows up with, you must return to be like children. And what I hear in that is, like, the rich man is the one who has a bunch of stuff, right? And they're afraid to let go of their stuff. And the child, they don't have anything. There's no fear of losing the things that they've collected. And so, as it relates to a more practical pointing, I see that the adult thinks they have a lot of things, but they just have a lot of ideas. And there's a fear of letting go of those ideas. And those fears is what presents us from becoming present. It's like, if I'm present, how am I going to protect all of these things that I'm holding on to? But a child's not holding on to anything. So there's no need to avoid the present moment. But super beautiful. Alex, man. Wow. An hour already. That's amazing.
Oh, wow. That's going quick.
Yeah. One quick follow-up about your book. I see that people can find that through your link on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a collection of all these short little quotes?
Yeah, so what it is actually is that I started writing and posting stuff on Instagram. And then once someone just said, you know what, if you turn your Instagram page into a booklet, I would buy it. So I was like, oh, that's cool. So then I turned it into a book. And actually, what's funny to mention is that I didn't know how to put it in chapters. So I had this idea like, okay, I should have chapters, it's a book. So I have to sort all these quotes into some kind of chapter. And I couldn't find that. I didn't know how to do it. I printed them all in my room and just looked at them, and I couldn't find like a red thread. And then what happened is I got very grumpy, and I was like, I don't know how to do this. And then I went to my girlfriend at that time to have dinner, and I was even not really present. I had all these quotes flying through my mind, I wasn't really present. And then at that night, I even dreamt that I was stuck. I was really walking and I couldn't walk anymore. But the next day, I went back to my place. It's like a 20-minute bicycle ride. And what was funny is that I was biking home and all of a sudden it let go of me. This trying to find out how to put the book in chapters, and it let go of me. And all of a sudden I had this intuition to not go home, but to have a coffee in a coffee shop somewhere. So I went to this coffee place. I met a guy. We talked to each other, and he said, like, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm trying to write a book. Oh, what kind of book? And I said, well, from the appearance, I have this idea of a book. It's called It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be by Paul Arden. I like that kind of book. And then he said, okay, stop. My first book was also inspired by that book. I was like, oh, I didn't know you're a writer. So he took his book that he wrote. It was called Spiritual Awakening the Easy Way. And I was like, wow, that's cool. That's the kind of book that I'm writing as well. So he said, hey, you can have it. So I opened it up. I saw his chapters. So what did he do? He put the process of spiritual awakening in chapters. And I realized, like, wow, I never thought about that. So my writings are just an expression of my own process, right? So I gave him a high five, went home. I wrote 7 chapters, just my own process in 7 chapters. And I got the quotes, and they beautifully fitted into these chapters. And then I had the story structure. So I thought might be a funny thing to share.
Yeah, that's interesting. My first book was also a collection of writings on Facebook at the time. And that was, my goodness, maybe 9 years ago. But it was the same thing. Like, I had the intention of writing a book, and then a year passed, and I was like, oh man, there's no book. And then I realized, wait, I've been writing it the whole time and I didn't realize it. And so then I just took all those quotes. There was like 600 of them, and I picked out the best 300 and just threw it together as a book. So nice. It's amazing how a lot of these things that we feel led to create are already happening and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. What's it called, your book, by the way?
That one was called Intimacy with the Silent Nothing.
Nice.
And it's not even available anymore. You might find some used versions on sale, but I took it down with the intent to do some editing and put it back up, and I never did, along with my other book, which was more of a written journey called An Explosion of Love, The Color of All Things Beautiful. And that one can only be found as far as copies that are being sold. I took them down just because I had some plans to do some editing and never really got around to it.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Alexander, thank you so much for joining me. And we can just point people to your Instagram page, and that'll be linked in the show notes. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this insightful exploration. You can find the show notes somewhere on my website, inlightconnect.com. And then we will be back again with some more heart-filled content to point you towards more love, compassion, and freedom. If you enjoyed this exploration, feel free to rate, comment, and review. Until next time, cheers.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this too.
You've been listening to an InLight Connect audio experience. We hope you've enjoyed this journey. If so, let us know. We deeply appreciate all feedback, comments, and reviews. Learn more at inlightconnect.com.